in China. Good evening to those who are in the US. I'm very honored to be able to address you across the ocean. I am going to speak about the ends of global Shakespeare as a genre in the field of study. There have been centuries of performances of Shakespeare in many languages, but in academia, the rise of global Shakespeare coincided with neoliberal policies of unrestrained free trade and more affordable international travel in the 1990s. Political and economic globalism enabled a paradigm shift in Shakespeare studies. Scholars began to realize that the study of Shakespeare should go beyond textual criticism and elucidation of the meanings of the plays. The World Shakespeare Congress, for example, took place in Tokyo in 1991. That was the first such conference to take place outside the West. In the past 3 decades, global Shakespeare has expanded the field's Anglo-centric outlook. But now, some scholars are questioning the notion of global Shakespeare as a neoliberal concept that bolsters the West's claim to Shakespeare's universal value after the Cold War. There is evidence to suggest that the educational institution, artistic institution, and political institutions that promote global Shakespeare have been co-opted by a new form of nationalism. So we now need new methods to theorize performances. How do we analyze diverse and polyphonic theater works, films, and adaptations around the world with an eye toward equality and social justice? I would like to propose some solutions, but let me explain in greater detail what the problems are. Epistemic justice is the challenge faced by global Shakespeare. This is injustice related to the creation and circulation of knowledge about the subject. Coined by Miranda Fricker in 1999, epistemic injustice is social injustice that is induced by uneven knowledge. It results from a number of factors, including the erasure or distortion of certain viewpoints, uneven valuation of authority or deferral to undue authority, unwarranted trust or distrust, and undermining some messages in communication practices. Fricker contrasts 2 types of injustice, namely testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. The first, testimonial injustice, occurs when one's voice is silenced or distrusted due to various biases. The second, hermeneutical injustice, results from the misunderstanding of someone's experiences due to lack of interpretive resources. Cultures that have historically been excluded may become unintelligible. This is especially true of subjects that do not fit established categories. Related to both types of injustice is what we now call citational justice. A certain kind of research is more prone to become marginalized. They may be cited less frequently, and therefore that knowledge is not in circulation. The field of global Shakespeare has not sustained substantive diversity because research has been deployed to enhance diversity quotas in scholarship and curricula in the UK, the United States, and Canada, as my own research has shown. Several scholars have raised questions related to this topic. Sandra Young and Chris Thurman questioned whether a global Shakespeare has been complicit in forms of cultural appropriation derived from a colonialist playbook, positioning a range of elsewheres as exotic distractions. By Susan Bennett's estimation, global Shakespeare has often been instrumentalized to serve world markets and, in fact, the interest of Anglo-American institutions. This tendency is reflected in habitual juxtapositions of global Shakespeare with Anglophone Shakespeare, as well as in editorial practices that ask scholars of color and those working on marginalized topics to explain subjects that do not fit with white Anglophone worldviews. Amrita Sen has critiqued the uneven expectations of scholarly labor, where no footnote is required for Aristotle's Poetics, but detailed and potentially distracting explanations are required for every single thing that is indigenous. This phenomenon is known as the dreadful explanatory comma. Basically, explanatory comma is when you pause to explain something before continuing. It becomes problematic, such as explaining a cultural reference to racial minorities, but not explaining whiteness. Come to think of it, Aristotle may be better off with explanatory notes. We would do well to explain the transmission of Aristotelian misogyny into English culture through a translation of an Arabic treatise, as Bernadette Andrea's work has shown. Analysis of white Shakespeare would be more on point by situating it not as a yardstick, but as a part of globalization. Due to the current structure of academia and hierarchies of cultural prestige, some scholars regard knowledge of Asian directors of Shakespeare as exclusively the responsibility of those who specialize in the subfields. They relegate that knowledge to footnotes of Anglo-European critical theories. These often inherited norms have predetermined what is worthy of scholarly interest in cross-cultural contexts. Maeve McEwen uses the term structural conditioning to describe the actions of previous generations that constrained agents in the present by having created the structural conditions in which they can act. So how do we counter this structural condition? The first step is to consider English language performances a part of Global Shakespeare. We can now also use more diverse theoretical models. There are many examples. We can draw on the Brazilian theory of cultural anthropology and present case studies without bracketing global performances as oppositional to white productions. In my new book, Contemporary Readings in Global Performances of Shakespeare, we present Anglophone British and Canadian performance histories as integral parts of Global Shakespeare. There is a bias that privileges only regions that are commonly imagined to represent the global. To correct this bias, my new book puts Anglophone Shakespeare on equal footing with non-Anglophone performances in order to deconstruct the tendency of national profiling. The action of national profiling basically falsely assumes each performance tradition exists in silos. My new book demonstrates the commonality and synergy between Anglophone and non-Anglophone productions. Further, to counter the misconception of the global as simply the non-Anglophone world, my book makes a point of offering case studies that place the cultural production of the UK and of Canada in comparative contexts. We counter Anglo-centric exceptionalism. Traditional approaches tend to assume that performances in the UK, US, and Canada are normative and aesthetically universal, whereas Shakespeare elsewhere bears location-specific, often political meanings. The global is often erroneously imagined to be whatever the United States and the United Kingdoms are not. Further, my book expanded the conceptualization of Global Shakespeare as a field by not only juxtaposing, but also connecting understudied regions and genres. I'll give you some examples. Akira Kurosawa's Japanese film adaptation of Macbeth from 1957, Throne of Blood, has been very canonical in Western Shakespeare studies. But few studies have traced the afterlife of Throne of Blood itself. Antunes' Filho has been inspired by Kurosawa and produced a Brazilian-Portuguese stage production called Trono, sangue in 1992. And this is just an example of the networks that adaptations are beginning to create for themselves. So it's not just the afterlife of Macbeth, but actually afterlife of Kurosawa's work itself. We can also think about how Armenian theater makers brought Shakespeare to Ottoman Turkey, or how Turkish performers influenced Iranian adaptations of Shakespeare. Beyond epistemic injustice, there is another challenge. Publishers often defer to what I call native informants on Global Shakespeare. They do this in the name of diversity. Native informants are researchers who are citizens of and reside in the country on which they write about. So they are kind of reporters on the ground. In my own editorial practice, in order to expand the field's reach and ensure meaningful diversity, I recruited contributors from distinct racial and ethnic backgrounds with unique lived experiences. Contributors' specializations are taken into account as well, independent of their geographic location. Their displacement may or may not have been voluntary. We can have someone who identifies Turkish, but has immigrated to the US, and so on. So if we think of Global Shakespeare not as a destination, but as a journey, we will be able to gain new insights instead of questions of provenance, namely where people come from or which country they represent. I examine artists' stories of arrival. How and why and with whom did they arrive here? We can ask these questions of fictional characters as well. Their journeys are often more intellectually rich and artistically interesting. We should engage in meaningful inclusion and recognize diasporic cultures and immigration cultures. It would be racist to recruit only contributors who serve as native informants based on perceived authenticity of their race and cultural coordinates. In terms of methodology, another solution I propose is called Heterotopia, the layering of real and virtual locations. Heterotopia is a new approach to analyzing performances, created by the craft of world making. Heterotopia is a type of space that evokes other cultural spaces, and that's essentially what performances are all about. First used by Michel Foucault in a lecture on architecture in 1967, and mentioned again in The Order of Things in 1971. The term heterotopia refers to cultural spaces that are transformative because of their contradictory cross-historical ideologies. While the initial context of the notion of heterotopia was architecture and urban design, it is useful in advancing our understanding of otherness. Foucault uses the mirror as a metaphor to explain how heterotopia operates as a virtual space. The mirror is a placeless place. In the mirror, I see myself there where I am not, in an unreal space that virtually opens up behind the surface. As technologies of representation, the stage and screen work the stage and screen are actually very similar to this mirror as heterotopia. Foucault writes that a heterotopia has the power to juxtapose in a single real place several other places, both imaginary and real, several, quote, emplacements. These emplacements are in themselves incompatible. And so in this sense, Foucault actually touches briefly on theater, saying that it is a type of heterotopia. Quote, the theater brings onto the rectangle of the stage a whole series of places that are alien to one another. And so heterotopia project and filter location-specific knowledge of otherness. The stage and screen exist in reality like the mirror, but they are a corner. The corner reminds audiences of their absence in the worlds of Hamlet or Macbeth. Audiences are on one side of the dramatic mirror, seeing shadows of themselves by virtue of their vantage point and not being on the other side of the mirror. Like the Foucauldian mirror, performances function as a type of heterotopia, making the place the audiences occupy both distinct from the dramatic space and connect it to other worlds within the performance. Heterotopia as a genre and a critical concept is all about in-betweenness. And it's also about throughness, basically the action of going through or also residing in between, in a new space. Global Shakespeare as Heterotopia is a collective archive of cultural outputs. It is similar to a museum with indefinitely accumulating time and space, so it's also a type of temporal heterotopia. One of the most effective ways to analyze these overlapping heterotopic layers of cultural meaning is thick description. We should engage in thick descriptions of adaptations. Not only can anthropological thick descriptions shed a new light on multiple heterotopic layers of cultural significance, but it also helps us combat several problematic tendencies, including national profiling that constructs linear, synchronic narratives that flatten the cultural production based on the stereotypes of its nation of origin. Thick descriptions reveal deep connections among works that may otherwise seem siloed. As such, they decolonize assumptions about global Shakespeare and serve as a corrective to what I call compulsory realpolitik, the conviction that the best way to understand non-Anglophone works is by interpreting their engagement with pragmatic politics. Compulsory realpolitik implies that works from the global south are of interest solely because of their testimonial value. Thick descriptions of the linguistic, dramaturgical, and design elements of productions will show that Anglophone and non-Anglophone productions are not always diametrically opposed in their ideologies and aesthetics. In conclusion, the study of Shakespeare can be enhanced by the ethics of care. Characters, artists, and audiences need care and give care to each other through mutual understanding. With new methods, we can turn Global Shakespeare into a network that provides maintenance and care to artists, audiences, and students, as much as they care for Shakespeare in certain shape or form. Audiences are also taken care of by the new vistas afforded by drama, thick descriptions as method, and heterotopia as a new critical framework, would cultivate a culture of care and promote substantive diversity, because heterotopia makes the plausible believable in drama. Thank you, everyone, for joining me this morning. Please feel free to follow my work at ajoubin.org, and feel free to reach out to me with questions and comments at this email address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very inspiring speech to all of us. And Professor Joubin, to my knowledge, is well known for her pioneering spirit to push the frontiers forward. And her work, of course, has demonstrated this new trend of thinking. And I'm very much impressed by Professor Joubin's